let me say good afternoon to all of you and to welcome to our virtual environment at university. Unfortunately, the pandemic conditions do not allow us to meet you as we wanted, as we would like. And so today and tomorrow afternoon at Italian time, we have some connections also from the United States. We will be together in this conference that was supposed, as you all know, to take place last fall. But we postponed it until spring 2021, hoping to try to be in presence, but here we are online anyway. So in this strange year, we had the tangible discovery of how important social connections are for all of us, but we have also learned how to manage technology much better. And so this conference had the aim to build a stronger network of contacts between the institutions that teach landscape architecture, and the distance that physically separates us will not permit to nurture these empathies that could be created in person, and allowing us to go a little bit beyond the scientific exchanges to cultivate human relationships. But on the other hand, we can say that from an ecological point of view, we can certainly say that this online mode allows us to contribute to the savings of resources, a consolation, and also an important novelty in the modalities of meeting that I'm sure will have repercussions also when the pandemic time will be overcome. So many of you have joined our proposal of this conference, and we thank you very much. And I hope that the debate will be stimulating for all of us. Let me share with you my screen. I want to make an introduction. Okay, so let me briefly introduce you to the sense of our these 2 days meeting. Many worldwide institutions have celebrated during the year 2019 the 250th anniversary of the birth of Alexander von Humboldt and the centennial of Ernst Haeckel's death, even if the second figure got much less attention than the first one. So the PhD in Landscape and Environment of Sapienza had planned to participate to these commemorations in order to draw on the thinking of these two scholars, and to try to understand how to consider the relevance that they had with their thoughts for our current state of landscape design education and for the contemporary society. But the pandemic has on one hand interrupted the celebrations, and on the other somehow amplified the importance of their scientific and creative legacy. Their inputs in the natural sciences, their cosmopolitan view, their transdisciplinary approach, and above all, the demonstration of the importance of interconnected systems offer important insights that are still fundamental to us. But also very interesting for the teaching of landscape design is their creative contribution as part of the scientific argumentation. Two concepts, what von Humboldt called Naturgemälde, sorry for my pronunciation in German and in English, and Haeckel defined as ecology, imply global relations between biotic and abiotic realms. The idea of connection suggests that everything is interaction and reciprocity, In fact, according to Humboldt, life is like a fabric where each thread is interwoven with the rest. He was the first to have the intuition of the earth as an as an organism and nature as a global force. And by coining the German term Naturgemälde, that literally means painting of nature, environment was considered as a unity, a living whole, and a collection of alive beings. This famous drawing that he defined a microcosm on a single page impressed strongly his contemporaries. We see represented the Mount Chimborazo with a rich set of facts regarding the locations that Humboldt climbed, the plants found at the different heights, the barometric pressure, the temperatures, the type of soil, or even geographical considerations regarding the tropical environment. This drawing can be considered a new concept of understanding space through data, like a modern GIS system would do today. So I would like to highlight few concepts that I think are still relevant from the method adopted by Alexander von Humboldt, and that I will try to synthesize for the sake of our discussion concerning landscape education today and tomorrow. First of all, the comparative purpose of the representation. All the data displayed on the board could be read at once and associated, and could be put in relation one to the other. Second, the collaborative and transdisciplinary approach of the research methodology. The collaborative, in order to produce these interesting and beautiful drawings and to organize the data collection and his texts, Humboldt relied in an incredible vast network of people, specialists in different disciplinary fields, who helped gathering the information and creating knowledge. Third, the holistic view of his thinking. Physics, the biological and cultural world were considered simultaneously. And in his essay on the geography of plants can be regarded as the first book on ecology. And Cosmos, a sketch of the physical description of the universe, is a text in 5 books that paints a general portrait of nature at the moment when the term scientist was introduced, announcing the professionalization of science and the beginning of the boundaries between disciplines. Fourth, the desire to speak not only of science, but to stimulate imagination. Humboldt's contributions combine careful observation of natural aspects with rich description of landscapes, usually illustrated with beautiful and self-speaking drawings, capable of transmitting intimate emotions as works of art do. As stated in the ongoing exhibit at the Smithsonian, his belief was that the arts were as important as the sciences for conveying the resultant sense of wonder in the interlocking aspects of our planet. On the other hand, Ernst Haeckel, who was a fervent admirer of Humboldt and an equally attentive observer of nature, during his travels not only discovered and described as his predecessor thousands of new species, but was among the first to make them known to the general public through his illustrations. Between the middle of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, he recorded a large number of sketches in magnificent drawings, recording the new discoveries on Earth of flora and fauna, and laying the foundation for the first studies on the biological differentiation among individuals of the same species on our planet. Very well known for coining many new scientific terms, some of which are in wide use today, such as stem cell, Haeckel had an important impact not only in science, but also in the arts. His original views, consequently, have had a profound influence on our current knowledge and on the notion of landscape. Of particular relevance are the invention of the term ecology, attributed to the science and analysis of the relationships between humans, plant, and animal organisms, and the environment in which they live. Haeckel took up the Humboldtian idea of nature as a single whole, made up of complex interrelationships, and gave it a name from the Greek word oikos, meaning house. So the earth as house for all the living beings in connection one to the other. Secondly, the introduction of the concept of biodiversity. Haeckel studied the biological differentiations among individuals of the same species in relationship to environmental conditions. Third, the act of drawing as the best way to understand nature. His book, Art Forms in Nature, is a visual encyclopedia in which, through the illustrations of the author, one could understand all the known living species of that time, looking at very accurate representations from the scientific point of view, but at the same time, these were extremely beautiful pictures, definitely belonging to the realm of artwork, very influential for the upcoming Art Nouveau period. Fourth, the importance for the human being to get inspiration from nature. Artists and scientists had to learn from the natural realm, conceived as a great laboratory capable of teaching us the unity of the organic and inorganic world and the beauty of forms. So Alexander von Humboldt and Ernst Haeckel were in fact researchers, philosophers, scientists, explorers, artists at the same time. And their thinking attests the importance of holistic connections and of keeping together the scientific, humanistic, and artistic approaches. For both of them, art was one of the most important educational tools because it spreads the love for and the understanding of nature. This international conference aims to evaluate the freshness of their thoughts in our present time, their legacy in the theory and practice of landscape design. Starting from these 8 points that I have just spoke of, which we could consider a sort of hardcore of our education in landscape design, we want to discuss our current teaching attitude. Let me speak of just 2 other concepts. We are all aware that in a world undergoing increasingly rapid and interdependent changes, it is no longer possible to tackle problems from a single point of view, but it is necessary to use different disciplinary approaches. Therefore, we need to move beyond single specialisms. Cooperation and coordination among disciplines is increasingly necessary. According to Erwin Laszlo, a philosopher of science who is considered the founder of the systems theory, there are no frontiers in nature that correspond uniquely with the boundaries of disciplines. For example, life is not necessarily limited to biology. It is also belonging to the domains of sociology and psychology, and it appears in the cosmos. In a word, disciplines are a kind of self-limitation introduced in the sciences, but their confines must be considered permeable, expandable, transferable. Only when we are able to overcome these limits, then knowledge can expand beyond the disciplinary fences. Quantum physicist Werner Heisenberg pointed out that it would be a serious mistake to divide the world into an objective reality and a subjective one, into a real world and a spiritual one. It is necessary to rethink this thesis of the classical sciences, as well as the fact that science can develop independently from other sources of knowledge, like arts and culture or philosophy. It is clear that there are different ways of knowledge and there is no hierarchy among them, and that the different ways of understanding are complementary to each other. In this sense, returning to give centrality to the creative thinking as important as the scientific one is fundamental. Only imagination can produce new solutions to problems, and imagination is a visual angle from which understand not only works of art and culture, but also institutions, social changes, scientific discoveries. Exterior world and interior world, as obvious, intertwine. Why I raise these arguments? I want to start from the two interlinked considerations. First of all, the growing credit that is given by media to the indisputable nature of scientific data and information. They're often used instrumentally and inaccurately to find hasty synthesis. Vice versa, we are aware also of the randomness that is attributed in a symmetrically opposite vision to creative thinking. These issues have repercussions also in the design disciplines, and specifically those related to landscape. Since the landscape project is not a commodity of first necessity, even if today this concept could be questioned, but involves space quality and citizens' well-being, design rules tend to be more subject to arbitrariness, especially on the side of creative sphere. Therefore, we tend to emphasize the scientific aspects, the irrefutable data, rather than the imaginative ones. Moreover, the increasing trend of our society oriented towards an administrative culture and the practice that tends to focus on aspects such, for example, the safety of places, which are certainly fundamental and yet are not the ultimate goal of a project, but only its premise, ends up transforming the aim of building beautiful and meaningful places into an application of functional principles. However, as demonstrated by the two personalities involved in this conference, it is precisely the scientific aspects that could stimulate creative thinking, and these two spheres of thought are inextricably linked. Repositioning those links between beauty and scientific values is almost a due act. A second reflection concerns the importance of drawing as the best way for understanding nature. The new digital tools in our possession allowed us to have incredible ways of measuring, recording, and analyzing all the characteristics of space, including sound, light, temperatures, hidden aspects of the territory, providing us with all possible data for understanding our planet. However, students are more and more losing their physical knowledge of land, their capacity of drawing, the material understanding of space, the capacity of embracing in a tangible way landscape morphology and its possible transformations. The incredible technological advancements will be able to warrant perhaps a good performance of space according to some given parameters, but will never help to define interesting and poetic solutions of the spatial configuration. So accurate representation should include the act of drawing as a tool for understanding and creatively transforming. The 8 concepts above mentioned could be reduced to keywords that synthesize the important aspects of landscape theory and design for us today. So the comparative representation of Humboldt, the collaborative approach among disciplines, the holistic view, the imagination on one hand, and for Haeckel, drawing to understand nature, biodiversity, ecology, inspiration from nature. So to bring back the union between art and science is an educational objective, an intention that is ultimately the cultural foundation of our doctorate and the object of discussion today. Let me just at the end of this brief introduction say that we will start these 2 days with 2 keynote lectures on Humboldt and Haeckel, by two distinguished scholars, Franco Farinelli and Rene, and the two sessions will be chaired by two professors, members of our PhD scientific board, Lucina Caravaggi, architect and full professor of landscape architecture in Sapienza. Her research is activities are in landscape design meant to explore contemporary environmental and social changes. And later, Pier Maria Corona, full professor at the University of Tuscia. His main field of research is forest resources, monitoring and management, and also geomatics for natural resources assessment. Our PhD in landscape has professors of different disciplines, and we try strongly to work on a single theme, that of landscape, with from different point of view. I'm sincerely grateful then to all our guests, and I'm honored to host them, even if only virtually, in our school. We have invited for tomorrow also major experts of two of these great scientists, but also distinguished professors in landscape design and theory of some of the most important schools around the world. So I thank all of them, as well as my dear PhD course colleagues that have contributed to the conception of this conference and will participate today and tomorrow in the discussion, or even only as listeners. And I also acknowledge Veronica Caprino, Liliana Impellizzeri Laine, and Tania Sacchellario for the organizational effort conducted with joyful enthusiasm. So thank you very much to all of you. And I give the floor to Lucina Caravaggi, that I hope she is connected now, and will introduce Professor Franco Farinelli.
Dear colleagues, dear PhD students, thank you for coming today. Thanks to Alessandra Capuano for organizing this beautiful international conference on the legacies of Alexander von Humboldt and Ernst Haeckel in the field of environmental sciences and interconnections with landscape design. Thank you for introduction, Alessandra. And so I like to introduce our guest speaker, Franco Farinelli. Sorry, ma Franco Farinelli is emeritus in geography at Alma Mater Studiorum University of Bologna. He taught for many years geography and political geography in Geneva, Lugano, Stockholm, Berkeley, Los Angeles, UCLA, Mexico City, UNAM, and at Parthenon, Sorbonne, and École Normale Supérieure in Paris. In Italy, he was the head for many years of the Institute of Geography and later of the Department of Philosophy and Communication Studies of Bologna University, and president of this Association of Italian Geographers. Currently, he teaches in the Institute of Architecture of Venice. Before giving the floor to Franco, I'd like to say something about his cultural footprint in the field of landscape and landscape design. The Weight of Landscape was a very important article for all of us, and I mean in particular a large group of researchers who dealt with territory and landscape in collaboration with Bernardo Secchi in early 90s. In the early 2000s, the book Geography: An Introduction to the Models of the World changed the way we looked at the world and think about landscape. Von Humboldt and his invention of the landscape play a central role in the evolutionary path of geography that Farinelli has traced in his work. Through this discussion, many of us have met von Humboldt and understood both the historical importance and the surprising vitality of his legacy. I think that without the critical mediation of Farinelli, this would have been much more difficult and, of course, less interesting. I would like to mention just 3 points, 3 critical statements of Farinelli theory, which I consider very important. First, the definitive demonstration that, starting from von Humboldt, the landscape cannot in any way be identified with an object or a system of objects. Farinelli's statement, now widely shared and widespread, is that the landscape is a way of knowing, a way of thinking, but also a program of action, cultural and social, and a way of understanding the relationship with the scientific world. The kind of this reflexivity seems to me still pretty far from the cultural landscape of the natural sciences, characterized by unshakable ontological identity. Second, the evergreen surprising fertility of the ambivalence term landscape, which at the same time indicates the thing and its representation. A term that allows to shift between different forms of knowledge, even distant from each other, for example, between aesthetic and scientific concepts, between pictorial and poetic knowledge on one side, a geognostic description of the world on the other. Through landscape, von Humboldt managed to convince the European and American bourgeois that learn the natural sciences. And what new meanings connected to the landscape are emerging today to face contemporary changes? Third, the analogies between the von Humboldt's method to study environment and Peirce's method to study the relationship between sign and object. I briefly recall the Humboldtian method, what included a first stage of suggestion, exactly the stage of landscape, that concerns the perception of harmonic totality. A second stage of disarticulation and reduction of the whole into parts that can be analyzed scientifically. And last and third stage, the rediscovery of totality by the awareness of the interdependencies between the different parts. This analogy was evident to me in the contributions of some Italian geographers and landscape designers, for example, Lucio Gambi and Vittoria Calzolari. It certainly justifies the love of these authors for von Humboldt. But I think that without further ado, I give the floor to Franco Farinelli, who once again I thank for accepting this invitation.
Oh,
please.
Thank you very much. It's a first for me to stay here with you and to talk about my hero, which means evidently Alexander Humboldt. He abolished very early the von from his name. It was a French Republican in a lot of senses. Anyway, I think it's true. And the width of landscape, I think the width is a very apt term, just in order to define the mix of cunning, in a sense, and bon mot, which is the basis of modern, contemporary use and meaning of landscape concept. The concept of landscape before Humboldt was a matter of painters and of artists. Only after paysage, landscape became a concept for scientists. And it was exactly Alexander Humboldt to assure this kind of translation from the realm of aesthetics to the realm of science. But this is, for me, is quite important, is very, very relevant, but with according to a political intention. I would add a layer, another side, another dimension to what till now we told about Humboldt. Humboldt's cognitive strategy was politically based. And exactly the problem for Humboldt was to assure, to guarantee the transfer of power from aristocracy to bourgeoisie in his own country, in Prussia, in that Prussia between reform and revolution. Just in order to remember a very important historical book about this kind of period, which means at the end of 18th century, at the beginning of 19th century. For that, Humboldt was able to fix, to produce a very strategy from a cognitive point of view. 3 steps. Eindruck, suggestion. Suggestion which arises in the human soul as originary manifestation, as a sort of feeling faced with the grandiosity of the nature, is our magnificence, the beauty of the nature. Exactly the cognitive form of this grandiosity and beauty is landscape, which is the first step in the cognitive Humboldt strategy. Nothing of scientific till now, only sentiment, only, today we say, emotions. This is a landscape at the beginning. With landscape, it's possible to catch a sort of aesthetic sentimental totality, which for Humboldt is the starting point of his own strategy. Just because he put landscape in this form at the beginning, put together totality and sentiment, which means the dimension of the word totality. Nowadays we say globality. And on the other side, the bourgeois sensibility of his own time. Nothing of rationality now. Only the manifestation of the psychic faculty of the subject, which is the protagonist of the Humboldt strategy. Eindruck, impression, suggestion. Eindruck is a composite word. Only in appearance. Druck means impression, and counts also for the impression of typographic characters on the sheet, pardon, on a sheet. I am in a sort of shelter, so I must organize myself according to not very usual methods. Anyway, Druck means impression. But what is very, very important is the prefix is ein. What is ein? It signifies one, evidently. But ein, in this case, has in reality a double function. On the one hand, it refers to singularity, to the individuality of the subject, which is normal for us, but was not normal at the end of 18th century. The individuum who finally is able to look, and in looking initiates the process of knowledge. On the other side, ein, it signals the attitude of the subject to reduce the heap of impression to unity, so that the plane of impression is configured as a totality, as a whole, arranged for the disclosure of the order which is hidden, according to Humboldt. The order of the world is hidden beneath the skin of phenomena. This is only the first step. The subject in his own finally conquered subjectivity, and in front of the subject, the totality of the world. And we know, and Humboldt knows, and Humboldt explains that the totality is not immediate. It's not possible to catch immediately. Just in order to catch, really, in fact, this kind of totality, which is the world, is necessary a second step. And the second step, the Einsicht, is the Kantian step, which means that it's necessary to disarticulate the sentimental unity, the sentimental totality, and to begin to translate this totality into scientific steps. Is only the second step, a second stage. A matter of translation from aesthetics to science. Is, if you want, is the Kantian moment of Humboldt's strategy, because was Kant the philosopher of Alexander von Humboldt in this case, and not only in this case. And again, we have a term, Einsicht, which begin with the prefix ein, the same of Eindruck. But this time, the second time, ein means completely other kind of thing. It's no more the subject, is the object. Sicht here means view, the gaze, strictly connected to reflective elaboration, to rational thought. But the uniqueness expressed by the prefix regards not the subject, but the object now, referring to the concentration of thought on a single element among those present, in the form of totality, into the good first impression. In this intermediate stage, which is the stage of a scientific analysis, is not the first, is the second, is the central of the three steps according to which Humboldt organized his own knowledge strategy in the intermediate stage, the stage of scientific analysis. There is no longer landscape, feeling, aesthetic impression, nor consequently totality, but only the cold and rational dissection of single components, So we have, in fact, a very eclipse of totality in the second moment. But this kind of eclipse is temporary, concerned only with the second of the level of knowledge. In fact, according to Humboldt, totality, cognitive totality, is re-established. The stage of Zusammenhang. It's not so simple to translate in English the term Zusammenhang. I think the only word possibly is complexity. The idea that everything is connected with all the other things. If you want to add one a terrible description of the word. And is exactly at the end of this process, of this cognitive process, that is possible at the stage of Zusammenhang, at the stage of complexity, to regain the idea of totality, constituted by the being together, zusammen, in a relation of interdependence of all the elements previously analyzed. Sentiment, analysis, complexity. And this means synthesis, the point of arrival, the last term in the cognitive process. In this, originally totality is transformed, and so to say, is restored, no longer on the aesthetic plane, the plane of sentimental impression, feelings, but on the scientific plane. In other terms, in other words, for Humboldt, all the development of all knowledge is nothing but a translation into scientific terms of a dawning impression expressed precisely by the landscape, which is absolutely not, I repeat, scientific, but without which, for Humboldt, all sciences would be impossible. Why the necessity for Humboldt of this kind of quite complex strategy? Why all that? All that amount of work? Because the intention of Humboldt, the polymath Humboldt, was a political one. And he is very clear on the subject. His own goal was that of tearing the German bourgeoisie away from the vacuous poetic games. The expression is of Franz Mehring at the beginning of last century, a century ago. And to provide it instead a knowledge which is capable of guaranteeing true scientific knowledge, the control of the world, no more the contemplation of the world, but the count of the world. But all this beginning exactly from, I quote Humboldt now, the distinctive literary education of the highest popular classes, of all the educated strata. In German, die Gebildeten. I find fantastic this term, die Gebildeten. The term who Humboldt used just in order to say the top strata of educated German of his own time. Die Gebildeten, which literally means those who are formed by the image, built by paintings. And in fact, coming back from his heroic, from a scientific point of view, to travel in America, in 1808, Humboldt published in Tübingen a very little book, Ansichten der Natur, aspects of nature, just in order to try to convince the whole European bourgeoisie to study the physical world. And this is exactly with this booklet that the concept of landscape changed for the first time in Europe, from aesthetic concept to scientific concept, passes from artistic and poetic literature to geography, to natural sciences. And this change with a new and literally revolutionary meaning, not only from the point of view of the history of knowledge, but from the point of view too of the history of European society. Even today, the term Ansicht, literally sight, means two things: what is seen and what is thought, signaling their unified sense, to see and to think. They originally, inextricably, their absolute functional coincidence. The field in which the realization of the Humboldt project take place is the field constituted by the totality of the bourgeois public sphere. It's not necessary here to quote Jürgen Habermas and this study about this topic. The first to introduce the modern concept of public opinion in Germany on the threshold of the last decade of the 18th century was Georg Forster, with whom Humboldt traveled to Paris in 1790, just in order to understand what was the Republican French Revolution. Forster came back in Germany convinced that was quite possible to replicate the German experience, French experience, and it was the head of the Mainz insurrection, you know. Humboldt, on the contrary, decided not upon political, but cultural revolution, and hinging precisely on the concept of landscape and on the structural mutation of its function from aesthetic to scientific. Aesthetic, politics, science. This is the Humboldt project. And this kind of mutation could only be realized starting from the artistic image, the sole image of nature, then now to the bourgeoisie, not only in Germany, but in Germany, much more than in other European countries. In other words, it was necessary to let the protagonist of the literary public sphere, the expert, the connoisseur of work of art, towards a vision of the world which could be developed into scientific understanding of the world itself, and which would no longer stop at the stage of the contemplation of the world. It was necessary, by this way, to try to transform bourgeois culture starting from his own aesthetic metrics, to change pictorial knowledge, to which that culture was limited, into natural science, suited to the domination and not solely to the mere representation of reality. And the landscape, the pictorial view, was, with Humboldt, starting from Humboldt, the instrument of this gigantic transformation. For Humboldt, indeed, strategist of critical bourgeois thought, the entrance into the field of scientific knowledge presupposed a total traversal of the, I quote Humboldt, realm of aesthetic appearance. The concept of landscape itself, which all the bourgeois recognize because they recognize painting and other artistic description, was conceived as the most appropriate vehicle to assure this kind of passage. You know, I would end with a couple of reflections. The first is a quotation from Heinrich von Kleist at the beginning of 19th century. He said that explorers, and Humboldt was an explorer, circumnavigated the globe to see if it was not perhaps more open at some point from the back. Of course, was not more open on the black side of the earth. But the problem was, for Humboldt too, globality. For Humboldt too, from the age of Humboldt, the problem was exactly the knowledge of the reality of the world according to his own global form, which is still now is exactly our problem. I think that what is happening around the world now with the pandemic and so on is exactly the signal of our lack of model which are able to try to understand which is now is happening. From this point of view, we stay exactly on the side of Humboldt 2 centuries ago. And the legacy of Humboldt from this point of view is exactly, from from the history of sciences, Humboldt, almost never Humboldt understood really. He discovered a lot of things, but of course, he never was able to understand all things he was the first to describe. But the legacy of Humboldt, I think, is exactly landscape model, better. What landscape means, which is, first of all, the necessity to think in terms of relation between culture, aesthetics, and politics. I think that this is the legacy, quite urgent, of Humboldt. Just in order to try with our models now, to try to bet according to Humboldt lesson. Thank you very much. Now,
thank you for your intervention, Franco. Bene, there are many interesting topics on the shift between aesthetic and scientific function landscape by von Humboldt that can be addressed by our discussants. Sara Prosassoni, landscape architect, Politecnico di Milano, and Giuseppe Scarascia Mugnozza, forest ecologist dell'Università della Tuscia Viterbo, both members of the PhD board in landscape architecture Sapienza, University of Rome. You have 10 minutes, I think, to allow the audience to ask any question. So I give the floor to Sara. Sara.
Okay, thank you. I'm an architect. I first, of course, thank Franco Farinelli for his lecture, like always, incredibly inspiring. A lot of things were already said by Alessandra Capuano and also by Lucina Caravaggi. Of course, my main question is to go back with our students with the importance of the reading by Alexander Humboldt from Franco Farinelli that in the field of architecture became really a reference point and produced a lot of transformations and a lot of new reflections in the field. And this is somehow something I would like to recall here. For sure, this idea of studying the entrance of the notion of landscape in the field of sciences produced on the reverse, if you look from another point of view, a strong effect also in the way we consider the landscape. And for sure, the first important element was that in the field of architecture for a long time, the question of geography and the question of the reflection about the question of the scale as a question that architecture is something that should be understood in a very similar way to what today we have understood from Alexander von Humboldt, always in relation to a global dimension, the totality of the question, and a very, very peculiar definition of a single point, the site-specific situation. About this, there is a very important genealogy that Franco Farinelli knows very well. The first article as architect we have read was published on the magazine Casabella. I want to recall not just Bernardo Secchi, but also Vittorio Gregotti, and basically all the reflection about the contribution of Alexander von Humboldt in the field of architecture and urban design recalls this relation between Gregotti and Secchi, and somehow the initial notion of anthropogeographic landscape that then was transformed in something for us even more influential, this idea of the design as modification of the context. I could say, and today I think we had also some stronger information about this, that for sure the reading by Franco Farinelli about Alexander von Humboldt produced a very, very important influence about the definition of this notion of design as modification of the context. The epistemological, the cultural revolution, which was somehow founded on these 3 steps, Eindruck, Einsicht, and Zusammenhang, somehow shows us that also in architecture, this relation brought first to understand that was possible to understand the architectural form and the architectural space also at the geographical level, and this became a new field for design. And this was somehow a big change in the perspective of architecture. Second thing, somehow the notion of context came up very different, because it was clear, starting from the contribution of von Humboldt and in general of geography, that the physical space and the physical context was somehow was supposed to be understood in a much more complex way, where the biological facts and the physical aspects were working together with the representation and the cultural elements, and somehow the notion of context, which works in the idea of design as critical transformation of the context, is a context which is exactly what already 200 years ago Alexander von Humboldt was precisely defining. And the third element was also somehow to have a relation with the question of image, representation, and structure. So the so-called invisible rational order of things in a very important way, behind the notion that was for me very influential also in my personal education, that design is always based on a first step where this rational knowledge about facts is leading a clear design. It is somehow something which is founding a kind of rational approach to design, which is still working in a very clear way, and that finds in the perspective that we have heard today a very important foundation. According to me, it is somehow not always, we don't always remember the fact that the work by Alexander von Humboldt was really based on a very strong action plan. So somehow science with a clear action plan, it is often what it is, we are somehow missing today, what it is lacking today, where often the engagement of the work of design is somehow lost in between the level of scientific knowledge and the level of artistic answer to the question. And so it is, according to me, very important to see in which way already 200 years ago, the idea of a world where the presence of human beings is based on knowledge, but on the other side of a strong action plan, it is very important. And somehow I would like to ask to Franco Farinelli what is his position in relation to some new positions that are coming up in the field of landscape, which are on one side interesting because through the ecological approach, we have understood that human beings are not the only living being present on the earth. And the idea of coexistence is very strong. But what it is for me still difficult to understand how this approach could be open to this new contribution without losing somehow the idea of an action plan and the idea of the fact that we deal with the world through the tool of design.
Yeah, thank you. I will be very, very short answer, evidently. but I would start from just adding some words to my speech. What struck me now is that exactly neurobiology is forced to appreciate the moment of feelings of emotion from a cognitive point of view. You know, we are no more the very strong, the very sharp separation, divide between emotion in a side and reason from the other side. We are now always forced from scientists to admit that emotion is the first and the more important act of knowledge, the starting point of knowledge, exactly according to Humboldt's lesson. Problem for me is quite interesting, is that Humboldt, in building his own strategy, was building a political project, you know. And in this project, the role and the meaning of the sign was exactly like the project. Very, very ambiguous. Very, very double face, you know, because Humboldt evidently was very, very know very well that to design is to make, to produce, to force. And his own relationship with maps, for instance, is quite interesting. Of course, for him, maps are necessary, but Humboldt came from Erdkunde, not from geography. And the point by which, for instance, Alexander Humboldt, the car written were exactly the same, is exactly the criticism of the map, exactly as ontological manner to define things. Humboldt knows very well that we must pass through maps. And so we must pass through quantities, through space, if you want. But the problem of Humboldt is place, is not space. You know very well that is the representative of a society in which what is necessary is the space, is the Weltbürger plan. And Humboldt is very conscious of that. But when we read Humboldt, it's possible to catch a glimpse of another vision of the world, to pass through the space just in order to preserve places. This is according to me, the reason for which till now Humboldt is one of the grandfather of ecologist discourse all around the world. Not only in Europe, in Western campus, exactly because you know, Humboldt knows very well that it's impossible for a map to catch totality, and totality is not a thing that you can produce putting together a lot of maps. Totality is the globe, and the globe is another thing. But you know, Humboldt knows very well at some time, you know very well that maps are necessary. For Humboldt, it was necessary to pass through bourgeoisie. He was an aristocrat, you know. For Humboldt, bourgeoisie was necessary just in order to pass through bourgeoisie and arrive to another world, The problem of Humboldt was the building of another world, which was not bourgeois, not aristocrat, was a world in which the ideals of French Revolution were still possible, were still existing. I mean, and so is the ambiguity of Humboldt practices is very evident in front of the design. Design is, you know, from an iconographical point of view, it's impossible to find image of character which is working on a map. Karl Ritter, the other master of Erdkunde, Karl Ritter is always writing, producing a discourse, a verbal discourse. Humboldt sometimes, yeah, is producing map, you know, but well, very easily. Anyway, I think that Humboldt nowadays, for all architects, geographers, and historians, and so on, Humboldt is always between us because he was the first, according to me, the only one to work with all the ambiguity of of his own time, when Marx was in Paris, was Humboldt who decided to send in another country, you know, and was the same Humboldt coming back in Prussia in 27 to convince, to force the king of Prussia to free all the slaves on the Prussian. It was a very, very quite interesting subject. And the problem is that Humboldt problem are now our problem. And his legacy of landscape is, alas, the only model we have just in order to think, for instance, to the European Convention on Landscape, you know. It's a fantastic document, Humboldtian document. He says, this convention says, pay attention, we have no more space, no more territory, we have only landscape. Reality is a landscape. It is Humboldt, evidently. Evidently, it's Humboldt. It's Humboldt legacy, it's Humboldt lesson. The problem is what you said, relationship between landscape and map. So no, according to a polarity, because they define a polarity indeed, a true polarity. We are exactly inside this kind of dramatical relationship, if you want.
Thank you.
No, thank you to you for your attention.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Franco. And now, without further ado, I give the floor to Giuseppe Scarascia, Mugnozza.
Right.
Please, Giuseppe.
Okay, thanks, Lucina. Well, thanks for the lesson of Humboldt, but particularly thanks to the lesson of Farinelli. Very nice lesson in a, also, let's say, in a philosophical approach to the vision of Humboldt. Fantastic also this dialectic, how can I say, analysis of his approach. But I mean, I am a forester, a forest ecologist, so I don't dare to reach the height of the philosophical discourse. But I mean, there are a lot of different aspects in in your speech, and also, of course, in relation to Humboldt lecture, that are very interesting to me, but also in general to us ecologists, scientists, if I can say, and also particularly foresters. First of all, I would like to start from one of your last sentences, when you said that the legacy of Humboldt is thinking in interrelated approach, unifying sentiment, knowledge, and policy, and also political issue, if I understood correctly.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, I make this point because I mean, present day we have some very distinct problems, beside, of course, pandemics. But I mean, the world, no, biosphere is in a big crisis, no, environmental crisis, so not only climate change. So these 3 points, I think, sentiment or feelings of the people, knowledge, but also policy and political approach. These are the 3 elements that are really critical in for sustainable science, or for science of sustainability or complexity, whatever you mean. Because if we do not try to put together these 3 different aspects, I mean, as we are not able up to now, we cannot deal and we cannot tackle the environmental crisis problem. So I mean, these 3 points are first of all really important. And from the complexity issue, I would like also to take another side vision from an historical point of view. You depicted very clearly the role of Humboldt in his world, bourgeoisie, aristocracy, but also, I mean, all the exploration of the world that were starting in 18th century. There were also other exploration, like, for instance, Malaspina and so on, but they were not able to collect this great amount of information, but most importantly, to communicate it. And this is also another legacy, I think, for today. We should be able to better communicate from science to public opinion. I mean, I don't know, bourgeoisie or whatever now is are the classes, but I mean, that's another point of view. But particularly starting from that period, I noted also another, how can I say, connectedness and some peculiarity. Many of these, let's say, new sciences started from a very tiny part of Europe, most of them in Saxony, close to Dresden, that was called the Florence, no, the Florence of the North. But I mean, this is fantastic, because the school of mining where he studied, where Humboldt studied, was not far from the first school of forestry that also started there in Tarrant. So, I mean, all these high institutions for the education of the people, but mostly for the education of the management of the natural world, started from a very tiny part of Europe. So I think that we should take into consideration also this aspect. I mean, why all of these new ideas started there? I mean, so in my opinion, and this is my question to you, management of the world, or I think, as you mentioned it, if I'm not wrong, in your article that was already mentioned by Lucina, the manipulation of nature was also one aspect, no, of Humboldt. At least he considered that, no. Also the problems that could be derived from that. So the question is, how, I mean, the legacy of Humboldt today could play a role in this, how can I say, contradiction or fighting between the conservation approach of nature and management approach, in order to tackle the environmental crisis that really is ahead of us. And then, I mean, there are many questions about landscape education and so on, but I mean, I don't want to.
No, but
please.
thank you very much. It's very clear your question. It is a gigantic question, evidently. 2 or 3 things I could try to say. The first, I quoted before Jürgen Habermas and his own, not only Habermas, but the Habermas interpretation of the condition of bourgeoisie still in the first half of 19th century in Germany. A condition of the was a bourgeois coming from France. And the ambiguity of Humboldt is possible to explain also from this point of view. The father was in the shores of Prussia, but his own mother was a bourgeois, and so the nature. Humboldt was a very close friend of Schiller, for instance. And for instance, Schiller said that the mountains signify freedom. Bourgeois culture of Humboldt time in Prussia was a culture for which nature was the only possibility, the only possible form of liberty, of freedom. And this is quite interesting, just in order to try to understand why in Germany and why so very little center nature was so studied. But the problem of Humboldt was that Humboldt was a believer, was believing really that the future was of mankind, not of French bourgeoisie, Prussian bourgeoisie. For Humboldt, the subject of the history for Humboldt is mankind, exactly according to French revolutionary lesson. And always and ever, Humboldt worked according to this kind of abstract subject, was mankind. And from this point of view, Humboldt was very able to recognize immediately the limits of capitalistic way of development. He wrote in the last edition of Ansichten der Natur, vision of the aspects of nature. Is very old when I think is the after the 48 of course 49, exactly 49, the year after the great Humboldt delusion, the Mitbestimmung, the co-management of the power in Prussia between in a part of bourgeoisie and a part of aristocracy. From the political point of view, Humboldt's experience was a complete failure, because when finally bourgeoisie arrived in Prussia to the power, it divided the power with the old enemy, the aristocracy. According to no more bourgeois originary vision, but according to politics. Well, and so it was a complete failure. He wrote in the last edition of Ansichten der Natur, he wrote a terrible, very few lines about Panama Canal. And he says, lots of people with a lot of money every year ask me where could be possible to made a canal in the Panama Strait, and I say always the same thing. You must measure, you must produce maps, and so after you can choose the point that is better for you, just in order to nobody never followed my advice. For me, as that Humboldt, he died very, very old. Humboldt was able to really in his life to see all the parable of bourgeoisie and of the beginning of contemporary capitalism, from the beginning to the final revelation of his own nature. And he wrote, capitalism is a thing, rationality is another. It's fantastic for me. Just in order because for him, after 48 delusion, because for Humboldt the end of crisis, 48 crisis was really a delusion. He was completely alone, completely uninfluenced. Was the man of another era, an old age, which was surpassed the past from the reality of the realm of Prussia. So bourgeoisie was for the young aristocratic Humboldt a very, very, very big delusion, and capitalism too. And this is for me the aspect much more interesting in Humboldt, because when he began to explore the world was very large. Was the plan of the bourgeoisie? The plan of bourgeoisie was to conquer the world, but it was a process. When bourgeoisie took the power, was the end of all the ideas of French Revolution, Republican ideas, and I think that from a lot of sides, we are still in the crisis which was so terrible for Humboldt during his last years of life. Rationality and bourgeoisie. It was not a coincidence, it was a contrast, it was a struggle between them. It was when when Humboldt says rationality, he means exactly the face of the earth and the nature, the great model according to which the first bourgeois were able to develop his own strategies. I think that is the meaning of the very sad last days of Humboldt.
Thanks. If I can add, nevertheless, despite this deceivement from a political point of view, his legacy in science is huge, because I mean, his quantitative approach is exactly what still today should be applied, and particularly in light of complexity of biosphere. So from this point of view, legacy is exceptional.
Absolutely, absolutely, you're right. Absolutely, you're right. No, he's very able to understand, but he was hoping for another bourgeoisie, you know, and we stop here because I think that could be so too long the discourse.
Thanks.
Well,
thanks to you.
Well, and now I found this interpretation very interesting, especially with respect to contemporary changes. So I ask to the audience if there are any questions or comments. We have space for some questions. 15 minutes about. Someone?
Anita, can I invite you to say hello? Anita Beritsbeya is the director of the Harvard School in Landscape. I'm very glad to have her here. And if you like to say something, we would be pleased. We know that tomorrow you are much more busy, and we thank you for being with us today.
Well, thank you, Alessandra, and to the students, the PhD students, and for doing this fantastic conference, of course. And thank you to Franco for this fantastic presentation. I wanted to ask you what do you think is the relationship between this sense that we get in Humboldt of nature as a source of freedom, a freedom from the strictures of society, and his travels to South America? What was he looking for there? Because he goes there also at a time when they are fighting for the end of colonialism, and they are fighting for their freedom. And of course, we know that they're also inspired by the French Revolution. And in North America, they had already declared and started the Revolutionary War. And in South America, they were lining themselves. And of course, we know he was close to Bolivar. But in the way he speaks of and writes, and here thinking of the views from the Cordilleras, he's always connecting his personal experience with what he is seeing. Yeah. And so this resonates, how you explain his strategy resonates very much with when I read him and his interpretation of the landscape of the New World, which of course he is saying is as old as the Old World.
Yeah.
And he has also a political agenda there, not only of freedom, but of establishing a more equitable or a more even sense of history between the New and the Old World. So could you expand a little bit on how he projected those ideas to his travels?
No. Yeah, it's quite interesting, your question, Madame. You know, he was a close friend of El Libertador, Simón Bolívar, for instance. But you know, we must come back to the structural ambiguity of Alexander von Humboldt vis-a-vis of his own relation with the power. Because otherwise, according to me, it's impossible to catch the nature of this fantastic man. You know, I think that his hope was to a development of bourgeoisie according to the French Republican ideals. liberté, égalité, fraternité. From my point of view, never Humboldt, from a theoretical point of view, never was always committed to this kind of program. Freedom and fraternité et égalité. But the problem is that, you know, I don't know in USA, we in Europe, we have a dictum that is to work for the King of Prussia. To work for the King of Prussia means, here in Europe, means someone who is able to understand, is able to conceive, is able to detect what's happening, but from the practical point of view, he makes exactly the contrary. And I think that this kind of practice was in some way was Humboldt was forced to play, just because the situation of first when I was speaking, I talk about the book of Reinhard Koselleck, Prussia between Reform and Revolution, which is another form to try to explain the natural ambiguity of the situation, of which Humboldt was one of the most intelligent, cunning interpreters. In front of the idols of bourgeoisie and the necessity, I'm talking here now for Prussia, in some way to control this kind of the development, because we never must forget that was the aristocracy which was at the head of Prussia. So it's impossible to separate, to divide the Humboldt meanings and significance of this kind of figure from the historical and political situation of his own time. And always he was a friend of men of which were trying to fight for freedom. Always, in every historical situation, but many times he acted exactly on the contrary. In Prussia, and not only in Prussia. Humboldt, the fascination of Humboldt is exactly the lure of aristocrat ambiguity. You know? It's impossible to understand Humboldt at his own time without referring his behavior to this kind of a political need. A very subtle way between aristocracy and between the bourgeois world which was to build. For me, Humboldt was him and his own strategy, and I stress the point. I insist. For me now, the relevance of Humboldt is exactly in his lesson, by which, according to which, it's impossible to distinguish science and politics. For Humboldt, it was impossible to have really science as science without a political strategy, and he was bourgeoisie was able to reach the power. This was the realm of bourgeoisie. Because he understood, and he understood that he was he was very old, and his life was manipulated from exactly the class by which he was fighting. And what was a relationship between aristocracy and bourgeoisie in the most terrible moment of European history? Non so se
Lucina?
You have some problems with the audio, Franco, with the microphone.
I'm sorry.
And so
maybe some of the PhD students want to ask some questions.
Well, maybe I can start with a very, let's say, quick and simple question. I would like to thank Professor Farinelli. First of all, it was very difficult today. I have to say, very, very difficult to follow all the description, but extremely interesting. And actually, this, let's say, political introduction about the role of Alexander Humboldt, I will remove the von, since you tell us that he didn't use the article von after he started war. And well, my question is related again to the relation between the process of mapping and the output, let's say, collecting, being, let's say, following what Professor Capuano and even Sara Protasoni already asked you. I would like to understand from your point of view as a geographer, what is the relation for you between Naturgemälde of Humboldt and, current contemporary computational design and in general digital visualization mapping, and how this kind of, let's say, great advantages into the mapping system could help us in a way to, let's say, tackle all that level of invisible science and, let's say, emotional characters of the landscape that Humboldt delivered to us through those amazing maps. That from my point of view, we can describe like landscape infographic, since they put together let's say, info and pictorial, of course, artistic image of landscape. So that's my question. I don't know if it is.
Okay. So is a very huge question, and we need a lot of time. But anyway, Naturgemälde for Humboldt was a manner of seduction. The problem for Humboldt was to speak the same language of bourgeoisie. And this language of bourgeoisie was an aesthetic one and was exactly axed on landscapes, paintings, and so on. On the other side, I repeat, Humboldt was very, very clever in detecting before I say that now neurobiologists are forced to admit that feelings are very, very important just in order to know anything. Okay, well, why it happens? Exactly because we have, and we had and I begin to give an answer to your question, a process of polarization.
Okay.
More you try to reduce landscape to maps, and more you will be forced to try to catch all that. This kind of reduction is for this kind of reduction is impossible to grasp. Okay, so from the point of view of the nature of models, map and landscape, they're exactly the opposite. On the they're contrary. But it's possible to try to translate a landscape in a map, exactly as now neurobiologists are forced to admit that I can, if I don't have any feelings of something, for me it will be impossible to know this thing. But which means that anyway, you will be always forced to invent, this is Humboldt. This is a Humboldt lesson, a sort of mediation between feeling and map. Between you can try to translate the landscape in another mapping language. Okay, it's possible. Probably is impossible the contrary.
Okay.
But anyway, please, you must know from the beginning that you will be forced to come back and try to consider something that is lost in this kind of translation, which is another manner to say that it's impossible to translate perfectly, completely. But I finished, but pay attention. The same is in the relationship between the globe and the map. It's impossible to translate perfectly the globe in a map. So people who try now to translate landscaping maps are moving according to a very, very old tradition, which is at the beginning of geographical tradition, you know. Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to you. Okay.
Is there someone else?
I want to thank also Sonia Dumpelman, and I saw also Alessandra Ponte from the University of Montreal that has joined our lecture. So thank you very much for being here. If you want to say something, please feel free. Carmen Andriani also. Okay. Ponte, Alessandra.
Briefly, because I joined late and I missed the lecture, but I was extremely interested to hear of Professor Farinelli on Humboldt. I just want to add a bit, because of like research I did on to explore more the French connection of Humboldt. Actually, he did his travels with someone that was trained at the Jardin des Plantes. I don't know if it was this was mentioned during the lecture. Bonpland was trained at the Jardin des Plantes, which was one of the great center under the direction of André Thouin, one of the great center of how do you say, plant exchange, plant information, and idea of colonizations, actually. Antoine was working with the Navy to create not just botanical gardens all around the world, but also acclimatization gardens. And it was a big project, a colonial project actually of France, of the First Empire and the Second Colonial Empire of France. This is also a comment of what Anita Beresbetia was saying before about, you know, the colonial project of European powers that pass a lot via plant exchange of information, center of what Bruno Latour calls center of what is it in English? Center of control for maps and mapping, but it was done for plants. And France had this project, this big project of creating, you know, acclimatizing plants. And Humboldt was involved in this and completely aware of these big projects, scientific and political project, because Tuan and Desjardins des Plantes was the only academic institution of that survived the French Revolution and became the Museum of Natural History and began immediately a big project again of colonization and acclimatizations with all the conditions that we, I don't know if you mentioned that, but I wanted to bring this point to the discussion that I think is relevant, interesting.
You're perfectly right. Aimé Bonpland was he traveled during the American voyage travel of Humboldt, and after coming back in Paris, Jardin des Plantes, and after he came back in South America, and of course, I have a fantastic story about that is really fantastic. You know, I said before that the mother of Humboldt was a bourgeois. The name was Coulomb, and he was coming from Paris. And he was a Huguenot, okay? So of the 16th century, the family of the mother of Humboldt came from Paris, came to Berlin. Now, in these days, a Brazilian young historian was able to collect all the plants, the first plants, gardens. And it was amazing because at the end of the 16th century, and Berlin was a very little thing, but already at the end of 17th century, was possible to find tropical plants in Berlin. The only reason this young was able to find, just in order to try to explain this fact, was that they were the plants which came from Paris to Berlin with the family of Huguenots find shelter in Prussia. And for me, this is quite interesting because when we read the reason for which Humboldt spent all the money of his mother, when his mother died, he left a lot of money to Alexander Humboldt and his son. And Alexander Humboldt took this large amount of money and spent all this money to organize his American travel with Bonpland. And the reason for which Alexander Humboldt wrote was the reason of this travel was to catch the nature with behind the skin of phenomena. I try fantastic this sentence I found because which means that all the American travel of Humboldt was nothing but a manner to know his own mother from inside, with the mediation of flower and plants. After 40 years, I spent 40 years studying Humboldt. I think that this is a very powerful reason for just in order to try to explain what was Humboldt's life in his own complexity. Plants were the mother. Well, I am not a psychologist, and anyway, I hate this kind of very sharp psychologism. But in a way, I think in this case, probably, at least, probably something of true is inside my last sentence. And I stop now, evidently.
All right, that was beautiful, poetic. Thank you. But I think, yeah, it's relevant, this connection. I think worth discussing more, but maybe in another side. Okay. Precisely because of your political analysis of how science cannot be separated by politics, and this key role of the Jardin des Plantes during the and the fact that it became the only academic institution that survived. So project that was in fact a big colonial project. So
Well, maybe.
Yeah, Alessandra, if you.
Yes,
I think we can conclude.
Yes, I think we should. There is a raised hand from the part of Sonia Duperman. We just 2 minutes, and then we go to the second part of the day. That it's Rainer William and the talk on Haeckel, and so we have still an important part to to go through. Sonia, please. Thank you.
No,
University of Pennsylvania, and she will speak tomorrow.
Yes, thank you very much. I just wanted to follow up, and we can probably discuss this tomorrow because it's a more general question. I was just curious what the role of Humboldt in geographical education in Italy is today. So, you know, we can just keep that question in mind for tomorrow and just go on to the next presentation. So thank you very much. Molte grazie for
thank you to you. Well, they're quite simple, the answer, nothing, you know.
Okay.
Humboldt came, you know better than me, Humboldt came to Rome when his brother William was ambassador in Rome, but he participated to a very important assembly of scientists in Milan, but we have no traces of his activity. And now, you know, Humboldt okay. Recently, we rediscovered the Ansicht in der Natur, and they have a very wonderful traduction 2 years ago, evidently, but not for geographers was important. Was important for scientists, botanists, volcanologists, but not for geography. Alas, because I am a geographer, you know that.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you to you.
Okay.
Well, thank you to everybody for this fantastic first part of the afternoon. I would like to leave the floor to Pier Maria Corona, who will be the chair of the second part of the afternoon. Pier Maria Corona is also part of the board, of the scientific board of our PhD. He is full professor at the University of Tuscia, and his main research field is forest resources monitoring and management, geomatics for national resources assessment, author of many scientific contributions, and part of the Italian Council for Agricultural Research and Economics. So please, Pier Maria, to you the floor to chair the second part of the afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Alessandra. Thank you, all participants. I'm very honored to chair this session on the legacy of Ernst Haeckel, and mainly because Ernst Haeckel, the current interest in, at least from my point of view, in natural sciences, is his contribution related to the importance of concept related to complex, adaptive, interconnected systems. And for us as foresters, we know Ernst Haeckel mainly because he coined the term ecology. And I think that the concept of what Haeckel defined as ecology imply precisely the concept of global connection between biotic and abiotic realms, the interrelationship between living organisms and their environment, including the cultural environment. And this is one of the main issues I have appreciated from his legacy. And of course, as a zoologist, explorer, philosopher, and even a very appreciated illustrator of biological entities, Haeckel has shown the importance of keeping together the scientific, humanistic, and artistic approaches. So our major aim here in this session is to illustrate his legacy and ecological thought straddling across nature, science, and art. And we have here just the right person, Professor Dr. Rainer Willmann. He's from the Lower Saxony, so he's from Göttingen, just the teeny part of Europe that Giuseppe Scarascia highlighted as the cradle of many scientists related to natural sciences, very prominent worldwide. And Professor Dr. Rainer Willmann has been the head of Department of Animal Morphology and Evolution at the University of Göttingen, and is a director of the Göttingen Zoological Museum. Göttingen is even one of the most famous universities worldwide that give courses even in natural sciences and in forestry too. And the main research of Professor Dr. Rainer Wilma is in paleontology, history of biology, theoretical biology, and he has wrote several books, and he's also the author of a complete edition of scientific and popular plates made by Ernst Haeckel. And so we are very, very honored to have him here, and we are very interested to listen his lecture, and I give the floor to you, Rainer, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, the honor is on my side, I must say. I'm very much honored to have the invitation to speak to you. So thank you very much, Professor Alessandra Capuano, for inviting me. Unfortunately, I cannot hand over a bundle of flowers to you, but should I come to Rome someday, I can do that then. Okay, I'm certainly not a landscape designer, and I'm not a landscape architect. So all I can do is say what Haeckel, how he was, what he had done, and what his perspectives were. And my topic is certainly quite wide. Nature, science, and art in the work of Ernst Haeckel, that's almost everything. Because as was outlined by Franco Farinelli, Humboldt and he united everything they saw, did, and so it's very difficult to keep things separate. So what I will do is give you an introduction to the life and thinking of Ernst Haeckel, and I will not avoid to speak about some critical points in his life that were not a problem in his lifetime, but today we have a different view to certain aspects of what he wrote and what he did. So at a later stage of my presentation, well, actually now, I need to share my screen with you because I have a PowerPoint presentation, which means I should press this green button here and this and share my screen. So, and where is my presentation? It is here. Wonderful. So let's start here. So you see Ernst Haeckel.
Very well.
You see him. Perfect. Nature, Science, and Art in the work of Ernst Haeckel. So what the thing is, in the field of biology, of course, aesthetics and science are particularly closely interconnected, and Ernst Haeckel was one of the foremost researchers who combined the two aspects. He himself made the drawings of thousands, virtually thousands of species that he described, and these pictures were used by many artists around 1900 for their own work. He traveled extensively through countries in Europe, Northern Africa, Arabia, and the tropics of South Asia. And as a talented painter, he depicted landscapes in more than 1,200 watercolors. That's something. Well, I need to shift you from here. Unfortunately, you will see something here, Windows aktivieren. I can't get rid of that because I have to get a new version of Windows, and my computer reminds me always with these words. So sometimes they might disturb you. I hope it's not too bad. Two other persons are extremely important in the life of Ernst Haeckel, apart from Humboldt. That is Alfred Russel Wallace and Charles Darwin. Of course, Darwin is always with us when we speak about biology and nature and what have you. It was this description of natural and sexual selection as the decisive evolutionary mechanisms that put evolutionary theory on a safe fundament in 1858 and 1859. And now an entirely new self-understanding of humans emerged. For example, it became clear that humans developed in nature and are adapted to the natural environment. Furthermore, it was understandable why there was in fact no difference between humans and other animals in principle, notwithstanding, of course, the differences of degree in the intellectual capacities. In fact, Darwin described humans as social animals, and so did Haeckel. Through the dissemination of Darwin's ideas, Haeckel became one of the most influential scientists of the 19th century, worldwide, not only in Germany, and you will understand soon why. As one of the most combative individuals ever to emerge in the scientific community in Germany, that's the words of one of his students, he was said to be both the most beloved and the most hated scientists in Germany. Beloved by his students and hundreds of thousands of citizens who read his books on natural history and philosophy, and hated by members of the church and by philosophers who did not grasp the significance of scientific progress, especially in the area of biology, of course. Through his lectures and publications, Haeckel encouraged millions of people to take a lively interest in fundamental questions of life. What you see here, Haeckel's best-selling books. It was The Natural History of Creation, Storia del Creazione Naturale, by tradition by Daniele Rosa, an important evolutionary biologist from your country, of course. And The Riddle of the Universe, Die Welträtsel, almost everything that he developed in his main work was repeated in these two books, or two volumes of the late Natural History of Creation. And the Riddle of the Universe was published in 1899 and translated into more than 30 languages. And hundreds of thousands of copies were sold in Germany alone. As knowledge of evolution of mankind was closely linked with fundamental questions of philosophy, it was largely due to Haeckel that philosophy had begun to take into account the findings of biology. And these two books contributed a lot to that. He himself attempted to establish a unified view of the world that he called monism. This was in the tradition of Humboldt and of Goethe, and of course, of many others who stimulated him to develop a new philosophy. Haeckel's scientific illustrated volumes and biological atlases became, as I said, sources of inspiration for many artists. They had a particular influence, these books, on the most successful stylistic tendency of the years around 1900, and that was in German, the Jugendstil, the Art Nouveau. The basics, and I will try to give you an overview of all his life with many things that I cannot mention, but the basics of his success as a biologist and his love for nature goes back to his youth. Haeckel was introduced at an early age to the study of nature and the natural sciences by his teachers, by his parents. For young Haeckel, three kinds of activities were particularly important. Botanizing, collecting plants. He wanted to become a botanist first, under the influence of Humboldt. Drawing was the second thing, and reading, especially semi-popular books of natural scientists such as Lawrence Oken, who was famous in Central Europe at that time, and botanist Matthias Schleiden. Matthias Schleiden was one of those who developed the cell theory that every animal and plant is composed of cells. Also important, of course, the travel books of Alexander von Humboldt and of Charles Darwin. They aroused in Haeckel a desire to undertake research trips of his own. Indeed, traveling and indulging in nature's beauties, often under adventurous circumstances, would become one of his favorite activities. Humboldt's aesthetic approach to science, but also Goethe's views about the relation between science and art, determined Haeckel's life after his study years. At that time, it was the study of medicine that led to the natural sciences. And so Haeckel had to study, well, a little bit forced by his parents. He had to study medicine, and he himself stated at an early age that he would never be able to work as a practicing doctor of medicine. His nerves wouldn't stand that, although in his study years, he was very much engaged in the care of people in his university cities. So his father encouraged Haeckel to stay the course because this would lead to natural history. In summer 1854, his university teacher Johannes Müller from Berlin invited Haeckel to take part in a research trip to the North Sea island Heligoland. As a result, Haeckel, now aged 20, wrote to his parents that his ambition was to undertake zoological research in tropical coastal areas. And after he had obtained at the age of 23 his doctorate in medicine, he devoted himself almost exclusively to biology. An important step in his career, both as, well, this is at the age of 17, Haeckel had collected plants for his herbarium, and that his herbarium is still preserved from Haeckel's time when he was at school at the age of 15 to 17. An important step in Haeckel's career, both as a scientist and a painter, was a trip to Italy in 1859 to 1860. It lasted for more than 1 year. Here he learned to know a German painter and poet, Hermann Albers. Hermann Albers, he's not well known today, not even in Germany. But together the new friends traveled around southern Italy. And during this voyage, Haeckel was inclined to abandon his scientific career and to spend his life as a landscape painter instead. Landscape painting was quite popular among German artists of the time. In October 1859, however, he started research on the marine life of the Gulf of Messina, in particular on radiolaria. Italy remained Haeckel's favorite country that he used to visit very often later, until he became unable to travel, in fact. In 1862, Haeckel became extraordinary professor at the University of Jena in Thuringia. That means he was not well paid. Well, he wasn't actually paid at all, but he had the chance to teach and to do some research together with one of his close friends, the anatomist Gegenbauer, Karl Gegenbauer. In the same year, 1862, his investigations on the radiolaria were published as a voluminous monograph, including 35 marvelous plates of illustrations. Radiolaria are one-celled planktonic organisms that are restricted to the marine realm. Haeckel had depicted about 150 species. Almost all of them were new, and he depicted them in all their astonishing diversity. Skeletons in the form of spirals, net-like balls with spines or with needles that were more or less sword-like, as you see them here, and what have you. Some balls with the cell plasma colored inside. And this was, of course, one of his steps, his most important step to his career. And for the first time, he had brought together artistic skills and science. His publication immediately attracted the attention of biologists, and it was in this work that Haeckel first openly aligned himself with Darwin, because he showed the variation of several species, and that was a bit premature, but he thought that one species could change into another even today. This was wrong, but it was quite impressive for Darwin, who received a copy of his work soon after its appearance. Well, with respect to Haeckel's scientific reputation, a lecture he gave on Darwin's findings at the meeting of the German natural scientists held in Stettin, which is now in Poland, was equally important. That was in 1863, and journalists described the lecture of the 29-year-old Haeckel as both brilliant and aggressive. It is regarded as one of the key events in the dissemination of Darwin's ideas in German-speaking parts of Europe, because all important scientists of Germany attended that meeting. And from now on, Haeckel followed a principle that Alexander von Humboldt had outlined. Humboldt had written that a common bond runs through all of living nature, and that the task of the natural scientist was to decipher and describe the unified whole, but also to consider the aesthetic features of nature. Haeckel went even further in combining science and art. However, Haeckel complained in art lessons at school, the focus on the beauty of nature as a crucial access to experiencing nature was hardly taken into account. Therefore, Haeckel said, and he was quite influential with his words, therefore he said, school needed to get reformed in two ways. First, with respect to an emphasis on the natural sciences, and second, by improving the contents of art lessons. Haeckel's main work was neither his natural history of creation nor his riddles or riddle of the universe, but Generelle Morphologie der Organismen. 1,200 pages on general morphology of organisms, morphology in the largest possible sense, biology, everything in biology he embraced by his word, morphology. And here he pointed out that before acceptance of evolutionary thinking, numerous biological phenomena could be explained only with difficulty, and the answers to many philosophical questions had remained unsatisfactory, if not impossible. But now Haeckel wrote, the discovery of natural selection had thrown such a clarifying light into the dark chaos of biological knowledge that no one with an interest in scientific progress would be able in future to ignore a new philosophy that is based on nature and that was now emerging. Based on the idea that everything in the universe was part of a unified whole, Haeckel developed a philosophy of a holistic view of the world, his monism, as I said, and in his main work on general biology, he developed also a comprehensive system of the sciences and placed biology on a new footing. In order to restructure the sciences, Haeckel introduced new concepts and numerous new terms. While many of them were never adopted, he coined hundreds of new terms, I think 220 or so. Many of these terms were never adopted, but others such as ontogeny and phylogeny have become standard terms in biology, and most famous, of course, is his term ecology and the related concept. He thus helped very much to establish the research field known under this name, ecology. Haeckel had a deep understanding of ecological interrelationships and even included humans in his considerations of biological interdependencies. Haeckel wrote, one must compare all life forms in their collective entirety, in their general and continuous mutual interrelationships. Darwin once stated, that Haeckel was one of the few who clearly understood natural selection. We all understand natural selection now, but at Darwin's, at Haeckel's time, it was quite different. Haeckel's statement also implied that Haeckel understood well the relation between environment and evolutionary adaptation. However, neither Haeckel nor any of his students ever worked as a true ecologist. Haeckel, in his Generelle Morphologie der Organismen, also produced the first phylogenetic trees. According to Haeckel, if Darwin's theory of evolution were true, it would be possible to reconstruct the genealogical relationship of each group of organisms. The linguist and philosopher August Schleicher had in 1863 sketched out a genealogical tree of the Indo-Germanic languages. And he also tried to reconstruct the Indo-Germanic primeval language. And inspired by this example, Haeckel devised his own trees, stem trees, as he called them. They are but a graphic representation of the phylogenetic relationships of a particular group of organisms. In the General Morphology of 1866, he devised the first little series of such trees for different groups. And these trees culminated in 1874 in the image of a mighty oak. So one of the most eye-catching elements of an undisturbed landscape, an old tree, went into his scientific work. However, Haeckel soon replaced this type of diagram with schematic drawings, but his oak underlined his feelings that evolution is life and that a stem tree represents nature and life. I will also allow myself to speak about Haeckel's philosophy a little bit more, because it all is one in Haeckel's mind. In Haeckel's monistic view, the diversity of the world's phenomena derive from a single principle, development. And after discovery of the principle of selection, Darwin had written that one could no longer conclude that the joint of a limb has been created in the manner of the hinge of a door by an intelligent being. For Haeckel too, it was clear that there was no place for a personified notion of a divinity or divinity in evolution, or in other words, there was no place for a creative power from outside. A dualistic view of the world was, according to Haeckel, not acceptable. No God and world on two sides of universe, of cosmos, or what have you, but the world as a unity in itself. There is a unity of natural causes and effect. There is a unity of the organic and inorganic world, of humans and animals, of nature and freedom, something that Humboldt had also said. And most important, matter and spirit were as one. Indeed, one of the main dualistic views Haeckel fought was the idea that there was a separation of mind and matter, or of body and soul. Haeckel described the evolution of mind from early life forms to consciousness in humans. So mind is a result of evolution. Evolution is a result of other causes. Last but not least, with a source in the inorganic world. The reconciliation of these apparent opposites led Haeckel to the idea of the monism, of the unity of the sciences. This in turn to his own conclusion: all true natural science is philosophy, and all true philosophy is natural science. This, of course, was an insult to the majority of contemporary philosophers, because until then, most of the philosophers were quite ignorant of progress in the sciences. Both Darwin and Haeckel were repeatedly accused of an ignorance of philosophy, but in Haeckel's own view, it was philosophers that had proved to be ignorant because philosophy had withdrawn from a study of the natural scientists. And in fact, there was only little exchange between philosophers and Humboldt, for example. After about 1860, Haeckel combined all this with a strong aversion to Christianity as performed to the church, not to an aversion to Christianity as in itself, but as performed by the church. The church's dogma stood in incompatible contrast to science, and Haeckel went even beyond that superficial aversion in his criticism of the church. His love for art and nature came in. He accused the church for having removed the beauties of nature from art, because Christian art was restricted to religious motives. Animals and plants, as well as entire landscapes, were displaced to the background at most. Remember wall paintings of Pompeii, with many of them were flowers and birds and what have you. And now the landscapes were displaced to the background at most. By this, Haeckel said, the church contributed to the destruction of the bond between humans and nature. The church, he said, had reduced man's environment to a field of work and hardship. Happiness could only be expected in the afterlife. In order to make the essence of his general morphology from 1866, to make it accessible to a broader readership, in 1868, Haeckel published his lectures on evolution as the already mentioned book, The Natural History of Creation, Natürliche Schöpfungsgeschichte. Actually, he used all his knowledge, all his attacks against the church, and also attacks against other authorities to work on the freedom of science and teaching. And he was quite successful with that, especially around the turn of the century, around 1900, when in Germany, a very conservative parliament and a very conservative emperor began to rule. For almost all scientists who were sure that life has evolved and is evolving, it was clear that apes were ancestors of humans. In 1863, biologist Thomas Henry Huxley, that was Darwin's bulldog, as he called himself, had introduced a broad readership to the evidence that humankind was descended from apes. Haeckel went beyond Huxley in emphasizing that the transition from ape to man occurred in the tertiary period. Thus, Haeckel thought mankind to be much older than was then usually assumed. In addition, he postulated a hypothetical fossil link for which he created a scientific name. So there was no fossil, but a hypothetical ancestor of humans, and he introduced a new name for that, Pithecanthropus, or ape man. And this name, Pithecanthropus or Pithecanthropus, ape man, this hypothetical ancestor in itself was a stimulus in art. The German painter, it's the picture on the left, the German painter Gabriel von Max painted a family of Pithecanthropus on the occasion of Haeckel's 60th birthday. So this was a birthday present. I think for a gentleman looking like the person here on the left, it would have been impossible to catch rhinos or whatever. Today, Pithecanthropus has a different name. It is Homo erectus because the Dutch anatomist Eugene Dubois applied this name, Pithecanthropus, to the primeval inhabitants of Java, to real fossils. The current name is, as I was saying, Homo erectus, and on the right-hand side, we see how we think Pithecanthropus or Homo erectus looked like about 1 million years ago. Haeckel devised genealogical trees also for recent humans. This is not in principle a legitimate approach. Haeckel, however, committed an unforgivable error. He shared the opinion that of the diverse types of humankind, some were much lower than others. Being deeply interested in evolution, Haeckel had hoped that one would find human communities that were far less developed than others, but there were none. And those that were there were as highly developed as all other humans in the world. Thus, his demotion, lower populations or lower humans, ran even in his period of time counter to every studied instance. Yet Haeckel chose to further emphasize his claim by writing that some populations were incapable of a true inner culture and a higher intellectual development. Even worse instances of disparagement were to follow. However, in his times, Haeckel stood by far not alone with such an opinion and a Euro-ethnocentric worldview. There is, however, one thing that needs to be mentioned. Several influential anthropologists and pseudo-philosophers stated that humans have had several different origins. They were so-called polygenists. As Darwin put it, insisting on the idea of different ancestry would be a step towards showing that humans are of different kind. Indeed, some polygenists said that multiple origins of humans justify suppression of others and even slavery. Actually, some writers keeping this view were themselves slave owners. They came from North America. So Darwin asked rhetorically and outraged, do not slaveholders wish to make the black man other kind? Darwin's grandfather on his mother's side, Josiah Wedgwood, had as early as 1787 been responsible for issuing a medallion against slave trade. This is this one. You see a slave in chains asking, am I not a man and a brother? Charles Darwin himself always emphasized human sympathy as the crucial characteristic of humanity. And Haeckel showed that human diversity goes back to one common ancestor. All humans are close. Conclusion from that, all humans are close sisters and brothers. Haeckel had made that clear, despite many racist phrases from his own side. And our common ancestor, under his view, under the knowledge of his time, was Pithecanthropus erectus, or the hypothetical Pithecanthropus that Haeckel had introduced in 1866. Shortly after the publication of the General Morphology, late in 1866, Haeckel went to the Canary Islands. In his report, for the first time, he expressed himself with respect to a spoiled landscape in public. This is not, but the first thing he wanted to do is to ascend the Teide volcano, just because he wanted to see where Humboldt had been more than 50 years before. Of course, Humboldt and Darwin were Haeckel's great heroes. And Haeckel, this is not the Teide volcano. I have not found watercolor depicting the volcano or any motif from the Canary Islands. So I thought another nice mountain might be also worthwhile showing. Haeckel was struck by the fact that much of the vegetation typical of the island, Tenerife, was already destroyed. He wrote, the pine forest, which in Humboldt's time still formed a mighty dense belt above the forest of Bay Laurel around the peak, is now almost completely cut off on the north side, as has the extermination of the forests everywhere on the Canary Islands. He went on saying that the same situation prevails in Southern Europe. The sad consequences, he wrote, the sad consequence of this destruction of forests is the increasing lack of water. It leads here as there to the desolation of what used to be the most fertile regions. A great part of Greece, Italy, and Spain are thereby utterly deserted. But not warned by this frightening example, unfortunately also our fatherland, Germany, and the North in general is letting its wonderful forests to be devastated. After that, oh, another nice picture, also not from the Canary Islands, but from Greece, Perkiomen, Corfu, a sketch he took in 18. So while Haeckel made friends among young biologists and enemies among philosophers and trod on many theological toes, he continued to publish scientific monographs on one group of sea creatures or the other. Haeckel's aesthetics merged all forms of perceiving nature, word and image, science and enthusiasm. Another picture, radiolaria, one-celled organisms taken during the voyage of the Channel. Because, I'm mentioning this because in 1876, on the occasion of a stay in Edinburgh, Haeckel agreed to study samples of the legendary marine expedition of the British research vessel Challenger. For a total of 12 years, Haeckel tirelessly investigated deep-sea jellyfish, radiolaria, siphonophora, and sponges, describing thousands of new species and producing scientific volumes with plates of the highest quality. He once wrote to his fiancée, Anna Sethe, for him, such work was comparable to traveling and enjoying the beauties of nature outside. He went into raptures when he drafted his thousands of scientific drawings. At that time, Haeckel was at the peak of his abilities in combining scientific accuracy and artistic skills. He even used flowery phrases in describing species. In his book Arabian Corals from 1876, written exactly during this time of his studies, shows still another strength of Haeckel's capabilities. Haeckel as a writer who sketched the beauty of landscapes in words. He, in 1874, he went to Arabia to study the marine life there. And he also took some landscape paintings, this one from Tours on the Red Sea coast. And an example, Meshafis, to show how Haeckel caught landscapes in words. He wrote about his visit to Tours at the Red Sea. The yellow sand desert, which stretches along the dark blue sea, is completely bare of vegetation. In the background of the desert, however, the mighty mountains of Sinai rise in imposing majesty with their boldly shaped peaks and rugged rock ridges. The entire harbor is a lovely coral garden. When we looked at the ground through the crystal clear tide, we were delighted by the most magnificent, never before seen coral bushes scattered everywhere in colorful diversity on the yellow sand, like exotic ornamental shrubs. Finally, the sunset poured glowing colors over the mighty red granite walls. Darkness quickly fell, and the cloudless sky was covered with a garment of stars that we had never seen before, sparkling with such brilliance. Today, Haeckel's publication is Art Forms in Nature, in German Kunstformen der Natur. It is being reprinted in many countries and many languages until today, again and again. And in devising each of these plates, Haeckel indeed resorted to every artistic device that he had essayed earlier in his scientific publications. There you see his sketch of jellyfish, Desmonema anasete, and on the right hand, what his lithographer made out of that. A plate wonderfully colored and clearly lithographed. This Kunstform der Natur is not only a scientific work, but also a work. It was this work mainly was a stimulus to many artists in his time. Among them are Hendrik Berlage from Holland. You see here a jellyfish on the left hand, Haeckel's original watercolor. Then as it appeared in art forms in nature, and top right, what Hendrik Berlage made of that, a chandelier that was created in Amsterdam, and below a lamp that was made in 1910 and was or still is in the Oceanographic Museum in Monaco. When Haeckel visited that museum in 1910, he was almost shocked in a positive way how much the architects of that museum used his drawings as models. Other artists that were inspired by Haeckel are Gustav Klimt, Louis Tiffany, actually, Alfred Kubin, the painter who's painting the firefish, is a derivation of nudibranch snails from the sea. Wassily Kandinsky, Paul Klee are also artists that took motifs from Haeckel, but most impressive is this one. The work of the architect Rene Binet, for whom many of Haeckel's drawings served as inspirations, and Binet is the one who constructed the best known work of art deriving from Haeckel's work, namely the monumental 45 meters high gate of the World Exhibition in Paris in 1900. Latrocarnium Reginae is the model, and on the right hand side you see what Binet made out of that. Today, Haeckel's pictures from art forms in nature are still used here as wallpaper, and that firm offers at least 5 or 6 wallpapers derived from Haeckel's in nature. Of course, for artists, the beauties of the hundreds of species to be found in art forms in nature were mere aesthetic forms. There is no need for them, or there was no need for them, to think about their biological significance and why they were as they are. For Haeckel, however, it was different. He always had in mind that the spines and, well, everything in the morphology of the organisms he depicted are adaptations to the environment of the respective species. For example, the needles and spines of radiolaria, well, this is not a radiolarian, this is another jellyfish. Well, okay. Needles and spines of radiolaria are adaptations to floating in the sea. The internal capsules that you can somewhere see, you can see it here. The internal capsules are protective devices for the cell plasma. Openings in the skeletons allow the cell plasma to move into different spheres and to extend in the form of so-called pseudopodia. And these pseudopodia are extended to catch minute organic particles that serve as nutrition. Back to this one. Haeckel was repeatedly accused of having idealized the organisms in his drawing. The symmetry, some critics said, were much too perfect. However, the skeletons of radiolaria are symmetrically constructed. Some critics who had not specialized in one-celled organisms simply couldn't believe this. Others said that it is impossible to see the details Haeckel had depicted. Must imagine the radiolaria are almost mostly a percentage, have a percentage, a small percentage of a millimeter in diameter. And some critics said that it is impossible to see the details Haeckel had depicted and that these details were pure fantasy. But they were not aware of the fact that Haeckel used the best microscopes available at that time. And they came from Jena, his hometown. Some microscopes were even constructed according to his specific needs. The microscope factory was only a few steps from his institute. Indeed, in the case of jellyfish, Haeckel had to unfold the tentacles that you see here, because otherwise he couldn't make the umbrella visible. And you must imagine these samples were in glasses of alcohol or other preservatives. And in these glasses, they don't look very nice. So Haeckel unfolded his samples, and his lithographer made even more beautiful pictures out of that. Again, one must point out that much criticism came from biologists who were simply not acquainted with drawing. For the art forms of nature, or art forms in nature, however, some specimens were redrawn and, well, let's call it optimized. But this publication was admittedly not only a work. So you see here the original drawing for his scientific work on the left side, and the same, well, the same species, the same specimen for art on the right. He painted watercolors of landscape primarily for his own pleasure and to keep memories. Color photography was still in its infancy, technically complex, and therefore then hardly useful outside. Haeckel also pointed out that taking a painting would force the observer to see every single detail of the landscape before his. The collection of another book that was entirely different from his art forms in nature, Haeckel preferred untouched landscape. This book appeared in 1905 and was called Wanderbilder, a traveler's pictures. And he showed people, they were natives, and Haeckel depicted them in order to accentuate the risk. In his book, Arabian Corals, he also described and painted on underwater landscapes, but I'll come back to this later. Here you see some of his motifs from his book, Wanderbilder. As I said, all these pictures were, all these watercolors were painted for himself primarily, but then he was convinced by some of his, by editors of some of his works, that he should also publish all this, landscapes that he had seen. These ones. Speak on Sri Lanka. As I said, in his book Arabian Coral from 1876, he also described and painted underwater landscapes, namely a Red Sea coral garden. However, in the accompanying text to the picture on the left side, he soon switched over to evolutionary topics and referred to the struggle for life in this breathtaking, beautiful environment. He never really separated science from the pleasure that nature gave him, and both of them from art. He simply couldn't. Everything was a unified whole for him. Well, Haeckel's understanding of art was obviously different from that of many contemporary artists in his time. His intention was to depict nature without any abstractions or simply. Impressionists, however, whose preferred motives were also landscapes, attempted to catch a moment's impression. Often the objects they depicted virtually dissolved before the eyes of the observer. This was never so in Haeckel's watercolors. Following Humboldt, once again, he underlined that nature is the model in art, and it has to be the model in art. This implies that art should be naturalistic. Monistic aesthetics, monism, Haeckel's philosophy, monistic aesthetics, Haeckel wrote, is the care of the beautiful. And in fact, Haeckel's monistic aesthetics was quite successful in around 1900, not the least because of its influence to Art Nouveau. Haeckel dealt also with the theory of aesthetics. For example, he constructed a system of the manifestation of natural beauties. He listed natural beauties in hierarchical order. First, biological beauties in general, then as a part of the biological beauties, anthropological beauty, and as a subcategory of the latter, erotic beauty. Haeckel always emphasized that symmetry is one of the key factors in sensing beauty. However, he said the beauty of landscape is entirely different from biological beauty. It is the kind of beauty that offers the highest degree of enjoyment. Landscape beauty, highest degree of enjoyment. But Haeckel noted with some surprise, in landscapes, you will almost never find any symmetries, except when you go into the details. We are now in the beginning of the 20th century, and by the beginning of the new century, an increasingly eager military armament of the great powers of Europe began to foreshadow the World War. Haeckel was aware of this, and Haeckel had always been an anti-militarist, and he became active as a convinced pacifist, writing a number of papers against war, against militarism, and what have you. In 1910, he added his name to a declaration of the formation of a Union for International Understanding. He supported the pacifist Bertha von Suttner. Bertha von Suttner won the first Nobel Peace Prize, in 1905. In 1913, Haeckel joined forces with the French socialist Henriette Meyer, a young lady, and co-founded with her l'Institut Franco-Allemand de la Réconciliation, that institution sought to ensure a lasting peace between Germany and France. And remember, the two countries were traditional enemies in the 19th century, so to speak. And in fact, l'Institut Franco-Allemand de la Réconciliation was also founded to care for peace between all countries in the world. But things changed as soon as the war began. Haeckel's pacifism gave way to a patriotic nationalism. He fell victim to the emperor's propaganda, as did so many German scientists, writers, and other intellectuals. However, this was not different from other countries, such as Great Britain or France. On account of the general tendency in this direction, but also with respect to Haeckel's racist comments, Haeckel's writings were viewed by the American historian Daniel Gassman and a few others as a prelude to National Socialism. This assessment of Haeckel overlooks a number of considerations. And I take these from one of his biographers, Robert Richards, who published a monumental biography in 2008. Richards said that these authors irresponsibly ignored the underlying social, political, and economical causes that favored the rise of Hitler. And Gassman also overlooked that writings banned as undesirable by the Nazis included exactly publications of Ernst Haeckel. And Haeckel's racism, that was hardly a rarity even among the educated during the 19th century. But of course, racism is racism. And this must be added as well. By acting against every sort of restriction on the freedom of thought, on the freedom of teaching and research, Haeckel would surely have been a perpetual irritation to the National Socialists. He was a free thinker, and free thinkers were, under that regime, more or less endangered. In recent times, I will come back to the dynamics of nature. Nature. In recent times, it has often been stressed that coral reefs can be equal to tropical forests in terms of species richness and ecological importance. Interestingly, this was already Haeckel's view of the ecosystems. In 1901, he wrote, "Both the tropical jungle and the tropical coral reef are amongst those wonders of nature that you have to see if you want to perceive and understand them, mentioning their thousands elements that grow into one another in a confusing and irritating manner." Haeckel's access to nature did not focus on single species or localities. He knew well that these are only little pieces in an all-embracing natural network. 2 points need to be mentioned here. First, Haeckel claimed that nature has become more and more important for people in an industrial world. He underlined that many citizens travel to the sea, go into mountainous areas or into woodlands because they need to relax from the pressure they undergo. The beauties of nature and undisturbed landscapes are important for humans' welfare, he said. Second, Haeckel was well aware that nature was already threatened by his time. One of his students, Haeckel's friend and his first biographer, Wilhelm Boelcke, who became extremely wealthy by writing numerous books of popular science, he was engaged in early nature conservation in Germany. As a biologist who dealt with evolution for over all his scientific career, Haeckel had always in mind that life and its environment is highly dynamic, not only due to natural causes, but also due to human impact. For him, as for many others of his time, it was obvious that human impact may result in irreparable destruction. Even as a young man, he emphasized the relationship between nature and our own species. In 1854, he had written to his parents about the extermination of forests that went hand in hand with culture. He added that this not only threatens the existence of the peoples who inhabit the forests themselves, but it also makes the land affected by forest destruction uninhabitable once and for all. Attempts to turn deserted regions back into fertile land would be in vain because, as the ancient civilizations have shown, the destruction of the forests result in a totally different climate, namely a dry, dehydrated, hot, and dry atmosphere. And he added there would be famines, and as a result, colossal emigration into those countries whose beneficial and beautiful forests have not yet succumbed to the axe of civilization. Haeckel wrote about climate change and climate refugees long before there were any suitable terms for it. So a central idea of Haeckel was that humans should not stand, in his words, humans should not stand outside nature or even in opposition to it. To achieve this, he wrote that return to nature and natural conditions is inevitable. This implies that wherever possible, spoiled landscapes should be reshaped according to natural models. And such a model implies ecological complexity, diversity, species richness, and all this also as an inspiration for us. And by writing that attempts to turn deserted regions back into fertile land would be in vain, by this he demanded simply that remaining natural landscapes have to be left untouched. These were political statements as well, because Haeckel's books were read by so many politicals and politicians as well. You will always hear all this today in the context of nature conservation, of course. Indeed, if we do not act as he said, well, I think I need not go further. Here, the results of biodiversity loss, climate change, and overpopulation are obvious. After completion of his last book, Kristallseelen, Crystal Souls, a rather strange book, in fact, in 1917, Haeckel worked on his own inheritance and concentrated on painting watercolors. In fact, this was all he could do. He had broken his upper femur a few years before, and he was dependent on crutches. He, Ernst Haeckel, who was wandering so much in different landscapes. Now he was almost unable to walk. Therefore, his paintings depicted the landscape near his own hometown, Jena, and many of these pictures were taken through the windows and from the balcony of his house. His house was a villa that he had built in Italian style. No wonder Italy, his favorite country. His last watercolor dates from end of June 1919. 6 weeks later, he fainted, fell and broke his left arm. Haeckel died a few days later on the 19th of August 1919, aged 85. Painting of Ernst Haeckel by the then quite famous painter Franz von Lenbach. And I think that's all I wanted to tell you. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Dr. Rainer Willmann. I would like, I wouldn't like to say almost nothing, because your presentation is very richly supported and very interesting and outlined from very different perspectives about this genius of Ernst Haeckel. And I would like to give the floor just directly to the two discussants. The two discussants are prominent scientists. Isotta Cortesi is a landscape. She is a landscape architect from University of Naples. And Renzo Motta is a forest scientist, forest ecologist and silviculturist from University of Turin. So I ask to Isotta first to share her thought about the presentation and about the legacy of Ernst Haeckel, and to make some questions about concerning the presentation.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much for sharing with us all your studies, your knowledge, and your deep understanding of the work, the scientific and the artistic work, and also the philosophy and the thinking. Thank you very much for this.
Well, I only presented what Haeckel has written and said.
Well, not only, no. I think I would ask some help from Veronica, because I have, I have three main ideas I want to maybe address to you, and I have set a whole way of discussing briefly through analogy, and so I need some images if they can help me to do this. I don't know how.
When you want, we can start.
Yes, you can just do them in loop. So my whole idea is that what preparing for this discussion, I looked through history and time, and of course, the whole idea of the scientific drawing to me is traced back to the Renaissance and to the drawings by Leonardo. So since then, I think the search for taxonomy and details was done by scientists through the means of representation. And we have masters in doing this, and we have masters in Florence.
Oh, this is apparently Binet, Rene Binet, the picture that just
and I want to believe that Haeckel maybe in his, I read he went to Italy 24 times, and I want to believe that maybe not only he was studying nature on the coast of Sicily, but he was also able maybe to be exposed to the prints. I think I want to believe this. So then many other scientists in time went through action of recordings, through dissections, and presenting everything through drawings. And all of them in time, up to him, were interested in scientific accuracy. But you explained, you told us, something very important is that he was actually the first scientist who was able to describe and draw things that were until that moment invisible. So he really revealed and structured a whole new reality and a whole new imagination, something that was never portrayed or represented before. And going through, the edition that you curated of his work, in time, I was really looking at how his work is really interplaying this science, his research, and so his an aesthetic, revealing the importance of bonding, form, and beauty. So he does this in his work, creating, I think, a sort of library of analogies, and this is why I want to expose you with my analogy through time, analogy in morphology, and a comparative study of forms. And in doing so, I think he has, and this is my point of view from an architect and landscape architect, I think he does this through, so he does not only record his findings, he does not only analyzes them, but then what he does, and maybe he does them in the moment he needs to print and to communicate his work. He does a great work of composition and assemblage. And he structures these plates through consistent rules. You were talking about the symmetrical layout. I mean, symmetry, a hierarchy, centering in the composition, finding a center. And this happens in many of the prints. And then what is very extremely interesting for me, that I then try to find a bond that goes beyond his time in relationship with art and aesthetics, is that when he goes into the fragment, into the invisible, he then takes this part and decontextualizes it. So the needle, for example. And so there is a progressive, I'm in my idea, abstraction of the detail. He zooms in, finds the very small part, let's say the original unit of the whole. And then it's exceptional because he then draws the volumes, the sections, the details, all at the same moment, all in the same plate. And in doing so, I think conceptually he discusses, presents, explains to the public how to link the very little, the micro to the macro, the individual part to the family of the species. Then something that I really would like to maybe discuss with you and then go faster, I think, is the idea of putting some of the plates on a black or on a dark backdrop, the back, and then he reassembles these figure ground images, separated, almost like floating in the void. And this recalls to me an idea, an aesthetical idea of the maybe the photography, where figures are standing out. And so he's a sort of interpretation of these organisms that are floating on a plane that is a deep, consistent space. And in a way, he's, to me, I mean, this aesthetic is forthcoming of images of the black and white movie. So looking at all his work through time, in a way, he, of course, is, had a great success at the turn of the century because of the attention to the elements of nature. But then also I've seen in this composition a lot of anticipation of surrealism and abstraction, because he takes, for example, circles of a detail and then also collages of objects. So I would say then, going to the end, also that these plates actually are a recomposition of something that is not happening in nature like that. So in a way, this is an incredible way of reassembling pieces, describing them, but reinventing them completely. So then, what about my last comment will be about the legacy with respect to landscape design today, and some of the images that went through. I think the way he was able to weave together the realm of science, the living organism, and the realm of aesthetics, which is the necessity for him, but for us when we design, of meaningful and recognizable forms. So in fact, one of the very last image, the image number 10, is something that I built as an analogy of a sponge view, a Munch projection, with a ground designed by a contemporary landscape architect. And it's not it's not secondary that this landscape architect, whose name is Catherine Mosbach, is first of all a life scientist. She's a biologist before becoming a landscape architect. And this idea of moving, like Haeckel, from micro to macro is something that she says it's very important in her practice. And it's also a way to balance the whole system, the the large scale, with something that we don't actually see. So, so I think within the landscape architecture practice and culture by design, I think there's a lot to discuss, and a lot of Haeckel's legacy to to discover and to embed in terms of growing in the culture and in the teaching, with the idea of fostering the bond between ecology and aesthetic in the design process. And I think that efficiency right now, let me just share this final thought. The fact that efficiency, sustainability, process, and programs are not sufficient nowadays to build richer and meaningful places where all the living beings can, survive or move or evolve together in the space we live in. So, you know, moving from representation, I think, to art and to landscape architecture. These are, you know, my three main field of investigation, and I thank you again for what you have shared with us today.
Okay, thank you, Professor Reiner. I would like to, I guess that is more straightforward to give the floor even just now to the other discussant, and so you summarize as a conclusion your answers to the discussants.
I will do my best. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So the floor is to Renzo Motta. Renzo Motta is here.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Please.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Pier Maria. Thank you, Alessandra, for the invitation. It's a privilege for me to be here. I learned a lot this afternoon. I'm not a forest ecologist. I'm not a landscape ecologist. I'm a forest ecologist, and but I am always been interested in landscape ecology. I have a all connection with landscape ecologists, because maybe you don't know that David Mladenov, that is one of the most prominent landscape ecologists in the USA, one branch of his family was settled near Turin. So I met David Mladenov maybe 20 years ago. I went with him to look for his family house, and he spent sabbatical in Turin. So he introduced me to the importance of landscape ecology. And when I was appointed as a president of the forestry degree, I introduced landscape ecology in our degree. And now we have many students that follow landscape ecology in Turin. I think that landscape ecology, as showed in this afternoon, it's really a tremendous way to analyze the natural side of the world, but also the artistic, the different point of view. And landscape ecology could be really a language that we use to share the different fields that in which we analyze the land and the forest from our point of view. Of course, I really appreciated the lecture of Rainer Willmann. His knowledge and his experience about Haeckel is tremendous, and it has been a privilege to hear your lecture. And really, the table that you showed were so nice that you can hardly believe that were painted 150 years ago. I thought in my lecture I presented to my student Ernst Haeckel as the scientist that coined the term ecology, but actually it was much more than this term, of course. But I have a small thought, and then I have a question to Rainer. When I was listening to your lecture, I remember that in the pre-COVID era, I was traveling a lot. I used to travel maybe too much, but it is important travel. And I remember that traveling maybe 20 years ago, I heard that in a radio program, a discussion about the past and the present of the university. And it was very interesting. They said that in the 20th century, the university have been transformed from the place of the culture to the place of technology. And really, it is true, because we are always faced with data, with data analysis, transformation, models. We compare our data with the data of the colleagues, and we don't have enough time to think. And this is a problem, because we know a lot about a very small slice, but we don't share our view of the world, our view of the life. And Alex Humboldt and Ernst Haeckel were biologist, geographer, naturalist, scientist, philosopher, I don't know, maybe artist, as you showed today, but mainly they were traveler. I think that travel, for example, also Darwin was a traveler. I think that travel is a perfect environment to think and a very strong incentive to reflect. Today we spent too less time to think, to share our point of view, and we are only concentrated to publish because, of course, the culture is not indexed, and we need papers at the end of the year, of course. But this is a very important reflection when we think to the travel and the work that has been done by Darwin and Humboldt and Haeckel. And I think the travel has been a very important key for them to analyze the world and to share their view of the world. But Ernst Haeckel, it has not been cited today that Ernst Haeckel was also one of the first proponents of the concept of Anthropocene era. And that's really interesting because now we are calling about land use change, the impact of the human on the landscape. Rene cited that he was very interested in the protection of the forest or on the management of the forest. But the question is, what is the heritage of Ernst Haeckel about Anthropocene as we can define today, and about the climatic crisis that we are experiencing now? Do you think that Haeckel, but also Alexander Humboldt, they were aware about the development that humanity had in the following centuries? What do you think, Rene?
Thank you, Renzo. Rainer, the floor is yours.
Okay. May I respond to Renzo Motta first? I think, well, Haeckel was not really aware of what would happen in the future with humankind. Overpopulation was not yet his topic. He thought that there would be progress in humanity and technology for the welfare of humankind. So the Anthropocene was seen by him quite optimistic. And he learned that from his parents, because there were so many developments in the 19th century, especially the rise of the natural sciences and in medicine. Imagine vaccination became quite popular. One of Haeckel's teacher, Rudolf Virchow, a great anatomist, Haeckel knew very well what happened in medicine, and that there were many effects that the humankind would benefit from. So this, I think Haeckel was quite optimistic, with one exception, and that was World War I. He was, by the way, the person who coined the word First World War. He saw immediately that this would lead to a catastrophe of a terrifying event, and in actual fact, this broke his optimistic view and destroyed the last years of his life. Many of his nephews were killed during the war. Others were injured, and he himself got support, interestingly, from France, because their milk and good bread and things were available. And friends from France sent this to him in Jena. And so he felt how terrible everything during that time was. And after he lived only 1 year after after the war ended, and I do not believe that he was able to look into the future in an optimistic way based on this experience during the last 5 years.
Thank you.
So for the
Alessandra, I don't know if we have more
yes,
time.
I think maybe Rene can answer also to Isotta somehow. And
yeah. Well, now I took a few notes. Well, I think the first thing in Haeckel's plates on a black background, to take this as an example, was to show all the details, the small things in a larger context, as good as possible. Of course, he could have done it otherwise. White background and black drawings. Well, he chose otherwise, I think, just for aesthetic reasons. And of course, Haeckel went from micro to macro, so to speak, but I think his drawings were made the other way around. He sketched the macro, and then he introduced the micros, the details, into his drawings. I can, of course, not speak about the relationships from micro to macro to landscape architecture, or his plates to landscape architecture, because I do not know which kinds of inspiration landscape architects would take from Haeckel. But yeah, then you said, well, the dark background, I think, as I said, it is mainly to show the details as with the best possible contrast. Symmetry, yes, Haeckel was, of course, fond of symmetries. He even tried to establish a system that he called pro-morphology, a system based on, well, kind of shapes of crystals. And he made drawings showing different kinds of symmetries in crystals and compared that to radiolaria. And he thought that the most primeval and primitive form in the organic world is a ball, a cell without a skeleton, just a ball. And everything else is, in his view, derived from that ball. Yeah. What else? You said that his species appeared to float on a plane. I'm wondering if, well, in some plates, he tried to catch the three-dimensional a three-dimensional view of the radiolaria. I showed a plate with a ball, and inside the ball, a central capsule, needles extending to all sides into the direction of the observer, from the direction of the observer into the opposite direction. But I think many pictures you showed in your series of pictures, one plate with of diatoms, unicell algae that are abundant in fresh water, and these appear to float on a plane. This is my experience, because in his time these algae could only be seen through the microscope, and in fact only in a one-dimensional aspect. Radiolaria were a different kind, because radiolaria not built that, skeletons of radiolaria are not built in such a compact way. So I would preferred to go from plate to plate to plate to plate and explain or try to explain why Haeckel decided to show the creatures in this way or in another way. And in fact, he also produced kinds of landscapes. For example, when he showed sea turtles, they were floating around in the water, and underneath and below that environment, he showed a landscape densely covered with land turtles. Yeah, that's all I can say. He is extremely diverse in arranging the specimens he had before him in plates. But it's true, Haeckel was always fond of symmetry, and wherever possible, he tried to arrange his specimens symmetrically. Even spirals, sometimes you have spirals on both sides of a plate and a long, a lengthy skeleton in the middle and what have you. Yeah.
I have a question, specific question. All these plates, he was doing some preparatory drawings, and then he would have someone to do the hatching for the prints, or would he do them by himself?
No, he couldn't, because these are lithographs, and he had a gifted lithographer in Jena. And the two, Haeckel and Adolf Gilch is his name, they understand and they understood each other perfectly well. So Haeckel made a sketch, and the lithographer tried on the one hand to be as close as to the sketch as possible, but otherwise to make the drawing understandable. For example, if it were pencil sketches, they were not very sharp. Haeckel's drawings were not very sharp, but Adolf Gilch knew exactly where the borderlines were, and he had a good understanding of three-dimensional skeletons and what have you. No, that was the task of the lithographer. Okay. But of course, Haeckel checked what that person had done.
I guess that we have to thank Professor.
But I wanted to have a little last question. Why there was not so much celebration, commemoration of the 100 years of his death? We could find a lot about von Humboldt, not as much. I found some papers that were celebrating the 100 years. Is this due to the issues of racism that were raised, you think, or it has to do with something else?
Well, I think in biology, no. I wonder, I think Renzo Motta said that university was a place of culture and became a place of technology. To a large degree, this is true. This implies that many of those scientists that were deeply, who lived as part of nature and sometimes, are today forgotten, because it was a different time. They had a different access to nature and science. And Haeckel is among them. Ask a German student of biology who was Ernst Haeckel, and you will get two replies: ecology and ontogeny is the short recapitulation of phylogeny. So in the development of an individuum, the whole evolution is repeated in a very short time. These are the two things that students of biology, and in fact, many of my colleagues relate to Ernst Haeckel. And he's not forgotten, but the complexity of his personality, the richness of his life, and all he did is not really present. Many things he thought and wrote are today self-evident, and nobody asks where they came from. The same is with Darwin. If you read Darwin's Origin of Species, you can forget all biology because everything is in there. Of course, not in modern terms, but who reads The Origin of Species today? It's worthwhile doing so. Yeah, so Haeckel was, there were many events celebrating Haeckel in 1990, but they were mostly local. For example, if University of Freiburg in South Germany celebrated Haeckel, members of University of Munich wouldn't notice. Or in Thuringia in Jena, of course, Haeckel was celebrated in several events. We had the so-called phylogenetic symposium in Göttingen. And of course, we remembered Haeckel in a few minutes. And so, yeah, ask who knows a lot about Alexander von Humboldt today in Germany. Only few will really respond. They might confuse him with his brother, Wilhelm von Humboldt, who reformed a university in Germany. And Alexander von Humboldt, after Napoleon, he was the best known person worldwide. And the same with Haeckel. Well, after Darwin died in 1882, it was not Thomas Henry Huxley in England who was the most famous biologist in the world. It was Ernst Haeckel, because Huxley's access to, or Huxley's influence in the scientific world was restricted, largely restricted to America and of course Great Britain and the colonies, but it was Ernst Haeckel's works that were read worldwide. His Riddles of the Universe, his Natural History of Creation. And even Darwin said, if what did he say? If he had read Haeckel's Natural History of Creation before he wrote in 1871, his Origin of Mankind, he wouldn't have been able to do that because everything is in Haeckel's work. Fortunately, it was translated into English only in 1876, and Darwin didn't take notice, not much notice before that. So he wrote his Origin of Man. Yeah.
Well,
so what we see in Germany is a lack of interest in the history of the sciences in general. And that means many do not understand the fundament they are working on. They don't know what they are doing and who and what was before them. And I'm grateful for the speech I heard from, forgotten.
Franco Farinelli. Franco.
Exactly. Yeah. Because, well, this is, his words opened the world we should also take notice of. I don't know what it's like in Italy, but here it's a catastrophe.
Well, let's say that we try hard in small environments like the PhDs to try to go in another direction, as in dissertation.
Of course.
And I really want to thank you for your generous lecture, as well as Franco Farinelli's one, and the generous participation of all my colleagues that really contributed to the raise of interesting questions. And we really, we have 4 hours and a half connected on the screen, so it's a long time. And let me please thank also for the not only the organizational aspects, but also the intelligent input, Tania, Liliana, and Veronica, who helped a lot. And of course, Lucina Caravaggi, Pier Maria Corona, Giuseppe Scarascia, Sara Prosdasoni, Zotta Cortesi, Renzo Motta for the interesting things we heard today, and to all the guests that are participating, also the ones that are going to speak tomorrow. I think it's very nice, this exchange that we are making. I know that we are always very, very busy with many things to do all around the world. I hope that this pandemic helps us to slow a little bit and to be able to to listen to each other. And I think this is a great opportunity. So I'm looking forward for the interesting speeches we are going to have tomorrow. And I say bye-bye to all of you. And all the friends that I see in the screen that came to visit, Alessandra Ponte, Anita Berizbeia, Nino Saggio, etc. Not only the people from our PhD. Thank you very much.
We thank you,
Thank you very much.
Alessandra.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Thanks. It was very good.
Bye.
Thanks a lot.
Very
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Grazie.
Ciao Renzo.
Thanks a lot.
Ragazzi,
Bye-bye.
Ciao
grazie.
Renzo, ciao a tutti.
Thank you very much. Grazie a voi.
Bye.
Bye-bye.